Can you talk about different foot presentations as compensatory strategies? Why, yes, Javi, I can. First, though, we should probably talk about normal foot mechanics, whatever the hell that means. But when I say normal, I'm talking about what is this bad boy right here, the foot, supposed to do as we walk. Basically, the foot alternates between two different general positions. There's different things that happen at each of the joints. But you have this alternating supination, which is basically, if this is the right foot, the foot kind of twists up and outward. And then as you land in the mid stance, it pronates where the foot flattens. And then it retwists upward into supination over the three phases of stance. Initial contact is going to be supination with the tibia in a bit of plantar flexion. The calcaneus, pay attention to that part because it's going to be muy importante when we talk about compensatory mechanics. The calcaneus is going to be inverted or tipped inward. The mid-tarsal joint is going to be supinated. The first ray is going to be plantar flexed. And if I plantar flex the first ray, that's going to correspond with big toe extension. And that is the heel rocker portion of gait. The next phase, mid stance, is when the foot flattens, which is going to be eversion of the calcaneus, tipping inward like so. The mid-tarsal joint, these bones right in the middle of your foot, are going to pronate and flatten down. The first ray is going to dorsiflex and come up, and that's the basically the big toe area and everything in between. And then the big toe is going to plantar flex. So everything flattens, and I go through the ankle rocker of gait, meaning the tibia translates forward into dorsiflexion. And then the last bit would be the propulsive phase or toe off in gait. That's where I drive big toe extension, and I get a resupination of the foot, ankle still in dorsiflexion, but then what's going to happen at this wild and crazy foot is the first ray is going to plantar flex down, which will help promote big toe extension. You're going to get a resupination of the mid-tarsal joint. The calcaneus is going to invert again. Boom. You've just completed the gait cycle. Life is good. Until it's not. And that's where we run into compensatory mechanics. General rule of thumb. If I'm in compensatory mechanics, basically what that means is the foot has lost its ability somewhere on it to express those phases of gait that we should be able to get into. Now, there's a lot of different foot compensations that can happen because here's the issue, folks. You can have one joint doing one thing and then any of those other joints that I talked about. So we talked about talocrural, the ankle dorsiflexing and plantar flexing. We talked about the calcaneus inverting and everting. We talked about the mid-tarsal joints supinating and pronating. We talked about first ray, plantar flex and dorsiflexing. And we talked about the big toe extending and flexing. So I could have a loss of movement options anywhere along that pathway. So you can have a lot of different things. But folks, the crux of your boy Big Z is to keep things ridiculously simple and practical. So even if you see something that's confusing, you at least have something that you can implement that should take care of most issues. And that's what I'm going to give for you today. Let's dive into some of the compensations. First, we're going to go at the calcaneus. There's two major compensatory strategies that you'll likely see at the foot, and that's either going to be the foot in general is going to be stuck in that early or initial contact phase where the foot is crazy supinated, or you'll see a situation where the foot is crazy pronated. Those will be the two primary compensations that you'll see in the foot. What that will look like is if I'm the supinated foot type, which is associated with either initial contact or it's associated with the late propulsive phase or the toe-off phase of gait, what will happen in that situation is you'll have a calcaneus that's inverted. You'll have the mid-tarsals will be supinated. The first ray is going to be plantar flexed, and then the big toe will be slightly extended. How do you know you have that? Well, I'm glad you asked. What's going to happen is you'll see a little bit of outside contact if you look at a backside view of the foot. meaning the heel is not going to appear collapsed. And if you see a plantar flex first ray, generally what that's going to manifest as is a big space between the big toe and the second toe. If you see that space, that means the first ray is plantar flexed. And that's associated with a early phase of gait or late phase of gait foot type. And it makes sense because I have to create the arch somehow. If I want to create an arch, I need to create space for the windlass mechanism to occur in the foot. So if you see someone and you're looking at standing and things of that nature, if you see a space between the first two toes, chances are you're dealing with a plantar flex first ray, and that individual is exhibiting supination or ER-based mechanics, and they're likely stuck in early or late phase of gait. Now, if you're doing some testing and you're wondering what kind of things will I be noticing, because it's one thing to just look at the foot at rest, and this is where other compensations will really trip you up. It's one thing to look at a standing foot position, but I would encourage you folks that you'll also want to be looking at ankle range of motion, subtalar joint range of motion, big toe range of motion. All of those will also give you some insight in terms of what type of foot presentation you're dealing with. For example, with the supinated or high arched foot type, if I have an inverted calcaneus and I have a loss of movement options, chances are they will have a difficult time everting. You'll see a loss of eversion. And interestingly enough, I just saw this yesterday actually with someone. One way that you can tell the difference between if you're dealing with someone who's more initial contact bias versus late stance bias is if I'm in an initial contact or early propulsion based foot, if the tibia is going to be more in a plantar flex position or the talocrural joint, well, folks, I'm going to have a loss of ankle dorsiflexion. So if you see a loss of calcaneal eversion, you see a loss of ankle dorsiflexion, you see a high arch when they're standing, chances are you have someone who is stuck in that initial contact phase of gait. And so you might work on activities that work on everting the calcaneus and flattening the arch. I saw this yesterday. I don't see it often, but it's pretty cool. If I'm someone who's more in that late stage phase of gait, big toe extension, and then they got to kind of really bow the arch up to touch the ground, you might actually see a loss of plantar flexion in the ankle. Normal should be about 35-ish, 45-ish degrees. They'll be at a loss for that. So that could be another way that you can check to let you know what position the foot is in, because obviously the foot is supinated in two different phases of gait, initial contact and then toe off. So that's the supinated foot type. Basically, you got a big arch, calcaneus is inverted. Things you got to work on for that particular individual is pronation. The other very common foot presentation is someone who is in more of a mid-stance based posture, or the foot is flat. Well, it could be fat too. With that, a lot of rhymes today, bars. The calcaneus is going to be more everted. That's going to allow the mid-tarsal joint to flatten and pronate. So that will drop down. You'll see a dorsiflex first ray and the big toe will be in flexion. How do you know what's going on with the toe? The toes will be a lot closer together. It's very common for this presentation to have the formation or the beginning phases of a bunion. And the foot will be flat. When you look at the backside of the calcaneus, you'll see clearly a lot of times the ankle bone, the medial malleolus, will be tipped really inward or medial in comparison to where the heel is. That's a telltale sign that you might be dealing with an everted calcaneus and a pronated mid-tarsal joint. Things you'll see. This person, theoretically, should have eversion. They may have a loss of dorsiflexion because it just depends on where they're at in the mid-stance range of motion. Because remember, with mid-stance folks, the ankle is beginning to dorsiflex, but they might not have eclipsed all the way to where they're at the maximum mid-stance position, right? So dorsiflexion is not necessarily reliable, but theoretically, a person with a pronated foot position should have calcaneal eversion. Another way you can check this is if the first ray is dorsiflexed, that means that the big toe is going to be in flexion, which means what, folks? If the big toe is flexing, and that's the concentric bias, and I don't have the other side of the equation, I'm going to have a loss of big toe extension. If you see eversion is clear, big toe extension is not, foot looks flat when they're standing, chances are you are dealing with someone who has a mid-stance based foot where everything is pronated. Things you would do for that, you got to get them to supinate. Get the arch, make sure they're feeling the outside heel when they're doing activities. Stay tuned. We'll dive into a little bit more about that. Those would be the two primary compensatory foot types. But folks, there's a lot of other potential things that you could see, because we talked about a situation where the foot kind of did everything. It just all went in one direction and it couldn't go the other. But what I could have is I could have a situation where the calcaneus is inverted, but for whatever reason, I could be trying to exhibit the opposite or the opposing mechanics, right? If this is more of a externally rotated, biased foot, I could have a situation where the foot is going to try to twist the other way to complete the phase of gait that they're so desiring. So that could lead to the mid-tarsals pronating. You could see an attempt of the first ray to dorsiflex up as a consequence, and that type of individual could also potentially develop a bunion. If you're seeing bunions, chances are you can know that the big toe is in a dorsiflexed and everted position. That's typically characteristic of a bunion, and the toes will bunch together. So there's a lot of potential things that you could see. The most common compensation that I see, and that will trip most people up, is someone who has an inverted calcaneus, but then, and this is where the first major compensation is that you'll see, is that the mid-tarsal joints, the bones in the middle, the midfoot is going to start pronating. This person will have the appearance that the calcaneus is everted and the midfoot is flat. A lot of times when you see this particular presentation, you'll notice that the leg is going to be externally rotated because the tibia is ERing, and they're trying to create that flattening or the mid-stance portion that they need for gait through the midfoot. But here's the issue. Even though the calcaneus is going to appear more everted, it's not. How would you know? Well, I'm glad you asked. The way you would know is by checking if they have passive calcaneal eversion. If they don't, even if the foot looks like it's in an everted position, it's not. What's happening in this situation is because the mid-tarsals are flattening and pronating, it's trying to drag the calcaneus along for the ride. So the calcaneus is everting, but it's not everted. And this can get really confusing because the solution for this foot type is to actually drive eversion of the calcaneus. And that's why you really have to check testing and cannot rely on foot posture alone. You have to see what ranges of motion are available, and then you have to go tackle that. So that's where this can get confusing for some individuals. Now, you might be thinking, whew, I got all these twists and shouts at the foot. I don't know where in the heck to start. Folks, I'm going to keep this ridiculously simple for you. You can see a lot of different compensatory things going on at the feet. And you might be sweating a little bit, and you're like, man, I don't know what the heck's going on. This person's got a bunion. It looks like this foot's similar to the calcaneus, and they don't have a bunion. I don't know where to go. Stop. If you could do one thing only, and get this right, and if you get this right, a lot of times it will take care of most issues when it comes to foot, it's to know where to put the calcaneus for these individuals. And I had a case this week that was an incredible example of that, because most people will try to cheat everywhere else but not put the calcaneus where it needs to be. This woman, She was dealing with plantar fasciitis, so to speak. Lots of medial heel pain, pain in the arch. And I went and tested her. It looked as though she was the individual who I was talking about, someone who had a flatter foot. It looked like the weight bearing was medially in standing. Get her into testing on the table, and she had a loss of dorsiflexion and eversion. So if you're paying attention, folks, what phase of gait would that theoretically be in at the ankle and the subtalar joint? Well, now you're looking at initial contact because she had the loss of dorsiflexion and the calcaneus couldn't evert. But the mid-tarsal joint was flat in standing, so she had a pronated foot. When you see that, what you're noticing is you'll have a twist because the calcaneus is going one direction and the mid-tarsal joint is going the other. And so that twist is probably creating some undesirable strain and tension in the bottom of the foot, potentially being a contributing factor to nociception, leading to a pain experience for this woman. So what I tried to do in that situation was attempt to drive eversion of the calcaneus. So I chose an activity that I've been using a lot lately that my daddy-o Pops was doing, the supine cross connect. If you want to see what that is, or if you want to follow Bill, or you want to see videos and pictures of all this stuff, you'll want to tune into the show notes after this one, which will be found on zachcouples.com/foot-compensation. But I had this woman attempting to do the supine cross connect where we were trying to drive calcaneal eversion. And here was the interesting thing, and this is when I really realized that, well, if you could just get the calcaneus to do what you want to do, it would be good. If you look at her foot positioning, she had two things going on up at the forefoot that I thought were quite intriguing. She had a bunion forming, pretty sizable one, on the big toe, meaning that the big toe then was dorsiflexed, everted, and then you had this valgus formation happening at the big toe. But then here was the other thing that was going on, folks. On the fifth toe, she had a tailor's bunion forming. So essentially you had these two V's on either side of the foot. And when I had her attempt pronation, she was doing this crazy thing where she was almost like twisting through the foot big time. So you could see her outside toes just like curling up super high. And when she was performing the activity, like the tuck was good. She was, feeling a little bit of glute. But by the fifth breath, she stopped and she goes, "Zach, that effing hurt." Really loud. I'm like, oh, well, I wonder what's going on there. Well, folks, what I think was going on was homegirl couldn't put the calcaneus where she needed to go. And so what she ended up doing, because she had both of those bunions forming, right, that signifies that's where she moves when she walks, because she couldn't get the movement happening at the calcaneus. So instead what she does for her phase of gait is she loads the outside of her foot a bunch, and then she loads the inside of her foot a bunch to compensate for the phases of gait that she cannot get into at the ankle and the subtalar joint. And so then you get abnormal loading through the fifth ray and the first ray, problems ensue. What was the solution? Well, the solution was we had to get her to move her calcaneus without moving her feet. So the first thing I did was call to awareness that, yo, homegirl, I want your feet to be chilling like Bob Dylan. That was step one. Step two, I assisted her into getting eversion by putting a wedge on the lateral calcaneus, so it essentially tipped her into eversion much easier. Kind of gave her a little assist. And folks, I wouldn't have known to do that if I had just looked at her standing foot posture, because she exhibited what is very common compensation. The tibia externally rotates, which allows the midfoot to pronate, and it gives the appearance that the calcaneus is everting. But you got to test, because when you look at her on the table, didn't have eversion. So I knew, even though visually my eyes were telling me, Zach, you got to restore supination in this woman. Do not, for the love of Pete's sake, put a wedge on the lateral heel to drive eversion. But you can't trust the eyes, fam. You got to trust your tests, and you got to trust what the client's feeling. Put a lateral wedge on. I had her take 5 breaths, call me in the morning with the same move. Got up, had no pain during the movement, no pain with walking, put a wedge in her shoe. Things were good. I would not have known that if I had looked solely at foot posture alone. But folks, that told me, that experience right there, made me realize that if you can't stack, don't talk to Zach equivalent of the foot is knowing where to put the calcaneus. And that could be for someone who has an everted calcaneus, getting them to invert, making sure that you're cueing outside heel contact. There's tons of moves on my YouTube channel. Check them out that involve that. I'll link a few of my favorites in the show notes. That would be one thing. The other thing would be if you got someone who's got an inverted calcaneus, you got to teach them to evert. And that would be cueing inside heel contact. So, I could potentially get into all the different potential compensations, but that doesn't matter if you don't know where you got to put weight on through the calcaneus, because the calcaneus controls what the rest of the foot does. If you look at the mechanics of supination and pronation, when the calcaneus is inverted, the mid-tarsals are essentially atop one another, and that locks the midfoot and forefoot in place. And then when the calcaneus everts, that helps unlock the midfoot and forefoot in place so you can get that pronation to occur. So if you can restore what the calcaneus needs to do, that will take care of a lot of issues. Is it going to fix bunions? No. Will it restore movement options in the foot? Highly likely. And if you do that, chances are that's going to take care of a lot of the foot confusion that you might be dealing with, and it's going to get you 80% of the way there. You might have to do some things big toe-wise, getting flexion and extension, but what I've found more often than not is if you can restore inversion and eversion, no one's going to mess with you. And that was really the crux of some of these foot compensations.